Welcome to On Point. I'm Sandy Chavez. Today we're talking about the rising popularity of podcasts. You can now find a podcast for every taste, from crime stories to comedy to motivational messages to political analysis, advice on health and nutrition, and of course, sports. Edison research says about 73 million people of all ages are listening to podcasts regularly. And the number of podcasts they listen to is rising from an average of 5 to 7 streams per month just this year. We spoke with some CSUN students, and here's what they had to say about podcasts.
On occasions, I will listen to podcasts more during my studies time, so that way I can be more focused, or trying to be more informed of what's going on in the situation at times, or just sheer entertainment.
I don't know. It's like a good chunk of entertainment without like having to be visually stimulated and give your full attention to it. Like, it's something that can play in the background, and it's like a consistent. It doesn't have breaks. It doesn't have like commercials and stuff, from what I know. The ones that I've listened to.
Yeah, same thing. And just to add on to that, what else? Podcasts. I think like on commutes, like rather than listening to music, I think listening to podcasts like makes your day more productive because you're listening to things that would help you like throughout your day, or like make small talk with someone else. Oh, I heard this in a podcast and stuff like that.
Going to school, I was listening to a podcast for like an hour because it takes me like 2 hours to get to CSUN. I live in downtown, and it's great. I was learning like a lot of things, like information that I'm not gonna get in school. I could get it through podcast, and that's easier for me. Instead of listening to music, I don't learn anything. Podcast, I do.
Timothy Tien is a CSUN student who produces his own gaming podcast called The Haycast.
I don't think podcasts necessarily would replace radio, specifically because radio is more live, whereas podcasts are generally pre-recorded stuff, so you don't get that breaking news aspect that you would get out of radio, for instance. And I feel like with podcasts, it's more discussion oriented, most of the time, whereas radio tends to be more just telling straight news, right? So podcasts tend to be more opinionated a lot of the time. People are discussing, and you usually have like a group of people with a lot of podcasts, at least the ones that I listen to, and at least with my podcast, it's more group oriented. So with radio, it's more live. You're getting breaking news, and you're getting just straight news rather than discussion.
Standing out in this rapidly growing market might be a challenge for anyone starting a podcast. But on the bright side, producing a podcast allows creators a free arena in which to express themselves. On Point's Manuel Fuentes has more on the story.
Thanks, Andy. I'd like to welcome my two guests today. We got KCRW Below the 10 podcast host David Weinberg, and we got KFI news anchor Aron Bender.
Good to be here.
Welcome to On Point.
Thank you.
So as we just heard, we have 73 million listeners who are listening each month to podcasts. Can you tell me why podcasts are so popular, David?
I think partly it's because there's money to be made in making podcasts, so a lot more podcasts are being made so you can serve smaller audiences, whereas before maybe you only had a couple shows that didn't suit a lot of listeners' needs. And so now you can make individual series that a small portion of people will like, but because of that you can sort of in some reach a larger amount of people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also is that Netflix mentality of I want to watch what I want to watch when I want to watch it. And podcast is the same thing. I don't have to worry about necessarily what time a show is coming on, or what topic might be discussed that day on some show that I maybe am into, but it's on the radio when I'm in the car. Podcasting, it's on demand. It's when I want to listen to it. I can pause it and come back 3 days later and pick up where I left off. It even rewinds it 15 seconds for me, if I just so I kind of catch up where I was before. But it's on demand,
Yeah. And can you tell me a little bit the difference between radio and podcasting, how it has changed throughout time?
I mean, with radio, it's like Aron said, you have to be in a certain spot at a certain time to hear it. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't do a serialized show in the same way you can now, where if you miss a certain day listening to it, you can. But I think lately, a lot of podcasts grew out of radio. You had radio shows that then became podcasts. I don't think it's working so much quite the other way. I don't think so many podcasts become radio, although with a show like The Daily, that is true.
Yeah, and I think also from a radio standpoint, And again, I do work in radio and we take our shows and we podcast those shows and do so in such a way that people can consume them, so that we take out most of the commercials, if not all of the commercials, so that maybe people aren't going to listen necessarily to all 4 hours of a show as it's airing from 6 to 10 at night or something. So the idea would be, well, maybe they can pick up where, at 11 o'clock at night, they can start the show, pick it up the next morning. They can listen on their time. And so that's why, from the radio side of things, that's why we create what we call appointment listening, which is, a lot like live sports. You can really only catch this as it's happening, at 8 o'clock tonight, or at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll have this special guest on.
So we just talked to a couple podcasters about the work. Let's take a listen.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the TSK Show. I'm your host, Eric, the Duke of Sports Sklar. I'm joined by my co-host, Tyler Kacholke. What's up, TP? How you doing, man?
Well, I think what our generation loves about podcasting is it's accessible at any moment. It's not live radio. It's pre-recorded. It's planned out and has a certain structure to it, to where you can access it at any time. You can pause it at any time and then pick it right back up if you leave it at a certain point where you can't listen to whatever you've been listening to.
Yeah, no, I just think just because of how social media and the phone in general is just like you're always attached to your phone. People didn't used to have this outlet as far as like you would just be always listening to music if you had headphones on. Now, like kids go to sleep listening to podcasts. People work out listening to podcasts.
When I play my video games, I'm listening to podcasts.
I think a big one's like commuting. People are listening to podcasts.
Yeah, when I'm in the car.
It's just, it's really accessible. And I think the best part about podcasts is the content. It's like content I don't think you can get anywhere else. It's way more personal. It's way more relaxed. And like, as far as following celebrities, you can really, learn a lot about them.
Yeah, it lets you peek behind the curtain a lot. And I think for us, especially as content creators in the podcast world, I think what we love most is the fact that we have free reign on what we can talk about, and we have complete creative control.
Can you tell me a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. I did a show called Below the 10, which refers to the 10 freeway. It grew out of a grant that the KSRW received to report on vulnerable populations, and so they took pitches, ideas, to do a year-long series. And so I pitched the idea of doing character-driven profiles of people that live in South LA, which is sort of an underrepresented area in a lot of ways in the media. And so I did 10 episodes. Each one is different in style and form. They kind of vary between, one of the nice things about KSRW is we have lots of different types of shows. And so I could do a food story for the food show, or I could do a human interest story for our storytelling show. And so I just sort of populated all of our radio shows with different pieces, and then together we put them out as a podcast called Below the 10.
And why do you think it's important to share the side of podcasting compared to radio?
Well, I think there's an intimacy that happens. A lot of people listen to podcasts on earbuds or in a car, and there's an immediacy to that. I think, human beings have been communicating in sound long before any other form, before writing even. And so I think there's something primal about, and you can say this of radio too, but I think there is something sort of primal that you're tapping into with a radio story, and I think that's sort of what drives a lot of the connection that people have listening to podcasts and to radio stories in particular.
Based on the podcasts you both have done, what makes a good and a bad podcast? We can start with Aron.
Oh, gosh. I could tell you all about the bad podcasts, mainly. No, I think the difference between a good podcast and a bad podcast, very similar to radio shows, TV shows, is I think there has to be a focus. I think there has to be consistency. When a lot of people set out to start podcasts, they have kind of a general idea. Okay, I want to talk all about entertainment. Okay, well, there are a lot of podcasts out there talking about entertainment. Let's try to narrow it down. Maybe we talk only about movies. Okay, well, now we're still talking about a very large amount of podcasts talking about movies. try to drill down and focus so that you can find that niche audience. And once you have them hooked, they're going to start telling all of their friends who are probably interested in that as well. And that's how you grow a podcast. And consistency. If you want to do a weekly podcast, it better be up every week. Because that's where I think a lot of people, they lose steam. They're really excited to do something right when it starts. And 3 or 4 podcasts in, they realize, wow, this is a lot of work. You know, it's a lot of work to book guests. It's a lot of work to record the podcast, edit the podcast, make sure it's good to go. And wait a minute, I just finished the last one. I've got to do another one tomorrow. So it does take a lot of time.
And what about you there? What do you think?
I mean, in terms of what I do, which is journalism mostly, I would say the key difference between a good and a bad podcast is editing. The first draft of everything I make is usually bad, and so it's important to have someone who can listen to that and give you notes on it and be able to make another draft, and ideally make several more drafts. And I think through that refining process is how you make things that are really good.
And I think also the idea of, with podcasting, you're not confined for time. You know, you've got somebody like Joe Rogan who does 3.5-hour podcasts, you know, and he does 3 or 4 a week like that because he just sits there and he has conversations with his guests. Others try to limit it to a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, because that's where they know they can get their best content down into.
And what do you think is the process of coming up with a topic? Let's start with David.
I mean, for me, it's all about character. Like, I try to find people who are interesting and compelling, and then the next step is like, is there a story there? Is there an arc? Is there, you know, all the elements of good storytelling? Can that be applied to this compelling character? And if you have that, then you just need access. You need the person that you want to do a story about to let you spend time with them. Most of what I do is sort of documentary style, so I'm spending a lot of time with people in their life, and if they'll let me do that, and they're compelling and they have a good story, then I'd say that's you have all the elements there to at least get to that first draft.
I wanted to ask you about that too, because like, how do you decide? Because this has been an issue for me over the years, trying to tell stories. I don't necessarily want to record 20 hours of talking with this person by, you know, I'm practically living with them. How do you decide?
I do want to do that.
Yeah,
that's the fun part for me. Like,
no, let me tell a story in 30 seconds, and you can do that in 3 hours, you know.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the funnest part of the process is the reporting, is being out in the field, getting to like go into someone else's life. I mean, like being a reporter is kind of like having a backstage pass to the whole world. It's like,
totally.
What do I want to go explore? Okay, I'm going to go explore that world. And so I really like enjoy immersing myself in someone else's life and spending time in a place that I wouldn't normally spend time in.
So do you record the whole time?
Oh yeah,
pretty much.
Unless they say off the record or something, and then I'll hit stop. But yeah, I mean, I'll get 100 hours maybe for a story.
Oh wow, that's a lot.
Sweating
for like a big half-hour documentary,
right.
Sure.
For a half-hour documentary, you've got 100 hours of footage or audio.
Yeah, I was editing a piece for Below the 10, and I spent a whole day with a street vendor, an entire day. So I taped for about 7 or 8 hours, and I used like half of a sentence from that day.
Oh my God.
Because she said this amazing thing, and I was like, oh, that's got to be in there. And then I realized, like, oh, that was the only thing that I used from that entire day of reporting, which if I hadn't spent that whole day, I wouldn't have that nice little nugget, you know.
But you have that freedom to tell those stories.
Yeah, that is a luxury of my job. I'm not on a deadline the way that, you know, typically if you're a news journalist on the radio, you don't have time to spend.
And, do you feel any pressure creating content, like coming up with content? Like if your audience will like it, or do you?
I don't feel pressure in terms of like pleasing. I feel pressure that I put on myself because I just want to make good stuff. And you know, the pressure sort of depends on what the constraints of the format is. So like with Below the 10, we didn't go into it saying you had to do this many episodes in this amount of time. It was just like, you have a year, you have this much money. So in that case, no. But you know, I also do file news stories. You know, I just came back from Mexico covering the caravan, and that was like, you have one day to go down there to get your tape, and then we have to have it on the air next week. So that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah,
but that's a different thing.
Right.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
And that's a different thing. So that is the case.
Is it hard to get or keep listeners based on your podcast and in your experience, Aron?
Yeah, I mean, especially for new podcasters, they have to understand that no one will listen. only your family and friends, and even they have to be convinced, and they probably won't listen to the whole thing. So you just have to understand that. You have to accept that not a lot of people are going to be listening, and maybe 6 months into it, you still might not have a lot of people listening, but good content always rises to the top. And if what you're producing is good content, people will hear it. It might not be as many as you want, as quickly as you want, but people will hear it.
What about you, David?
Oh, I agree totally. I have the luxury of working at a station at KCRW, so we have an audience, and so we can put ads on the radio for shows, and it'll bring a certain amount of people there. But to get them to stay and then to download it consistently, it has to be good, yeah.
And do you find it hard to compete with bigger companies with podcasts? Like, how do you deal with that?
I mean, I don't deal with it.
Oh,
it's
okay.
not like that's sort of like a question for my bosses. Like I just go out and I
Let's
make
call them right now.
the best thing I can make, and then I give it to them, and like that's kind of on them to decide how many people should listen to it for it to be worth their investment.
And we could go to the reverse side. Like, what do you think about like smaller markets trying to compete with bigger markets?
Well, I think podcasting, and I think David can speak to this as well, podcasting allows people not in larger markets to have an impact worldwide. I mean, I could put something on iTunes today, and then in a week, I could see that it's been listened in New Zealand, or I was going to say China, but I don't know if the firewall is going to allow that. But you could have listeners all over the world in the next week or two. Whereas if I'm starting out in radio in Wichita Falls, it's probably only going to be about 50 to 100 people listening on at any given time, and that's going to be the extent of it.
Yeah, if you look at so today actually some of the top 10 lists came out from like the New Yorker and a couple of other big places, the top 10 podcasts of the year. Mm-hmm. And a bunch of those shows were produced at like New Hampshire Public Radio and like tiny public radio stations that like the audience that show had on the air was probably pretty tiny, but because it can go out over the internet, like their audience is, magnitudes bigger. And now that it's been mentioned in these publications, it's going to be huge for them. So that's like a kind of like leveling the playing field, I would say.
Yeah, and I think also if we look back to the days of internet radio, you have internet radio stations now like Dash and others, but there are very few. Whereas when internet radio first started, they were offering a lot of the same things that radio stations were offering, so it didn't really take off. Mm-hmm. Whereas now, with podcasts, they are offering stuff that radio just can't. At KFI, for example, we work in 8-minute segments generally. Sometimes they'll be a little bit longer. In podcasts, you can go as long as you want. And you can tell that story beginning to end. You don't have to tease to the next break. You don't have to tell somebody, okay, well, we've got to take a break. We have to end it right there. No, if they've got more story to tell, you can tell more stories. And that's the benefit of podcasting.
So a small market, but a big impact, you could say, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And how do you make your podcast stand out? Like, how do you reach that audience? Like, I want to make it stand out, be unique. Like, we could go with you, David.
I think it's just quality. Like, if your stuff is good, people will like it and listen to it. I mean, how to make something good is debatable, and I feel like, like a chat show, like, people having conversations, that's all about chemistry and getting popular guests. The bigger the celebrity, probably the better your numbers are in those situations.
All that cross-promotion.
Yeah, and then in terms of storytelling, it's like, do you have a good story? Does it have a satisfying ending? All that kind of stuff, I would say, is what sets things apart in that world.
Yeah. What are you, Bender?
Well, I think, just to kind of touch on what David was saying, the idea that, chemistry is really important. Even if it's just one person, that there's got to be chemistry with that person and the microphone and the listener. They've got to connect somehow. If somebody's just opening a microphone to talk about their day, and they don't really have anything to offer beyond, okay, here's what my day was, and it's just kind of a ho-hum type schedule or routine. They're not really offering anybody anything. But even Seinfeld, he'll say he's got a show about nothing, but no, it's not about nothing. You've got these really, it's a character-driven show. We like these characters. We like to hate these characters with the choices they're making. And so if you've got a podcast that's full of interesting characters, whether it's coming in and out of the host's life or the host is part of that.
Is it pressure not saying the wrong thing to offend people? We could start with you, Bender.
Wow. There's a lot of pressure radio-wise to not say the wrong thing, because we've got FCC regulations to try to watch out for. I think a lot of radio people who get into podcasting find it liberating, because you don't have a lot like what Eric was talking about on the piece there. You don't have management breathing down your neck to not offend the audience. They find it liberating because now you can curse on podcasts. But I think that's one of the main things that people get into podcasting for, is that, oh, finally I get to say what I want to say.
Yeah. What about you, David? What do you think about that?
I mean, I agree. I feel like although I would say the other side of that coin is, if you say something really offensive and it creates a giant, if it creates a lot of attention, that could be good. So there's like a danger to like be provocative in that way, just to get listeners.
Hot takes.
Yeah. It's like, you could have a whole podcast called Hot Takes, where it's just people being offensive, and that would probably be a pretty successful show,
Yeah.
But, there's all these elements, like if you have advertisers, there's a line, like what are your advertisers going to put up with? So it's like kind of up to everyone to sort of draw that line for themselves.
Like maybe management, you don't have management looking down, but okay, well, you've said something offensive and the 5 advertisers you had have now backed out. So what do? Are you working another job so that you don't really need that money for the podcast? You could just keep doing the podcast until the advertisers come back, or now you have to go get a job because your advertisers pulled out.
And do you think you can make a living off of this based on your experience? You think it's possible?
I mean, I make a living at it.
Not like for others who want to start off. And do you think it's...
I think if all you want to do is make a podcast, it's going to be really tough.
Uh-huh.
They say, and I don't know if this is still true, but I hear that like you have to have at least 20,000 listeners, regular listeners, just to get advertisers to take your call. Oh. And even at that level, you're probably not going to be making enough. 20,000 people listening to your show is probably not going to provide you enough income to survive. But if you're willing to stick it out and make something good, you'll get better at it, and then there are opportunities. But it's definitely possible.
And yeah, I mean, a lot of people have done it where, you start slow and understand, unless you're a celebrity starting your own podcast, you're not going to have a built-in audience at all. You look at the Adam Carolla podcast, I would imagine he and Joe Rogan and Mark Maron, they probably make millions from their podcast because they've got those audiences that are in the hundreds of thousands or millions. So yeah, the advertisers are going to pay, so they don't really have to do anything else. But that's the 1% of the 1% when it comes to podcasting.
And what is the process to make money in this? Is it just with advertisers, or how is the process to that? We can start with you.
Advertising one way. I come from the world of public radio, so you could pitch your stories to stations, and then they would pay you as a reporter or contributor. You could apply for grants. Those are hard to get, and they take a lot of time to apply, and then if you don't get them, you're out all that time. I mean, those are sort of the avenues that I'm aware of to make money at podcasting. The other way is to get hired on someone else's show and work on it while you pursue your own idea.
Yeah, you could do that. You could also, if you reach that stratosphere where you can do live appearances or live shows, then maybe there's a talent fee for that. But I think for somebody just starting out, don't even think about money. I mean, really focus on the content, focus on the product. The money will come if the product is there, if the content is there. But if all you're worrying about is focusing on money, then it's likely not going to happen anytime soon.
Just looking back, since you both are in radio, and someone told you, in the future you're gonna be doing podcasting, what would you tell them now?
Like, what's podcasting?
Yeah,
I mean,
is that
it didn't exist when I was coming up, but I mean, I feel like now podcasting is a cool thing to do.
Yeah,
so
it's like the in thing.
Yeah, it's like so. If it existed and had been as popular as now, I would have said that's great.
Yeah. That's cool for you, right?
Yeah, or working in restaurants,
What about you, Ben?
Well, yeah, I mean, if somebody told me that there's going to be a way for people to just on demand, a lot like audiobooks, I think, listen to people tell stories, then yeah, I'd buy into that. I feel like the way Steve Jobs handled the iPod and putting music on demand, yeah, podcasting, if somebody tells me that, yeah, you can listen to really quality stories being told when you want it, yeah, I'd buy into that for sure.
I think if someone said to me, you're going to get this job where you get to fly around the world and talk to people and get paid, I would say, yeah, whatever you want to call it, I'll do it.
Like, say no more, right?
Yeah.
Podcasting, reporting, it doesn't matter. Yeah, I'm in. Yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate you both for coming here. I know it's raining outside, so I appreciate the time to come here. And yeah, thank you for tuning into On Point. See you next time.
You love their music. Why would you steal it? When you illegally download your favorite band's music, they might just disappear. Downloading music without paying for it is just not cool.
Come on, let's go.
Just a minute, I gotta finish this.
Wait, you're gonna post those pictures of Mary?
Yep. She thinks she's so hot.
But her mom and dad will see them. Her grandmother, her little sister, everyone she knows, it's gonna kill her.
Who cares? Just a couple of pictures. It's no big deal.
No big deal? Don't. This has gotta stop.
Me and my boy Matt had it good. He had catnip that was off the hook. But one day, he brings a girl home, and she's allergic to cats. Every sneeze was a nail in my coffin. Now I'm in a shelter. It's decent, but they don't even have Wi-Fi.
First time I tried Vicodin, it was laying around my mom's house. I didn't know they'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
We appreciate our guests, KCRW's David Weinberg and KFI's Aron Bender, for being with us. Thank you for watching On Point. Remember, you can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can also listen to us on KCSN 88.5 FM Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on Santa Clarita Valley Television Sundays at 5 and on LA 36 at 9:30 Thursday nights. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Sandy Chavez.